Hello, ladies and gents, it's Justin Johnson. I'm on module DD211, Understanding Politics, Ideas and Institutions in the Modern World, DD211. Influence youth today, young adults, young teenagers, mature teenagers, OAPs. Better your life circumstances. Maybe you want to change and diverse your lifestyle to a new business, new era, a better version of you. Anyway, get yourself into adult learning, university. Anyway, on page 190, chapter 18, the European Union. It could have financed the belief, the unwillingness to engage in such Eurozone level reforms during the high point of the crisis, and the heavy-handed interventions in debtor states produced very strong backlashes against a system that did not demonstrate the kind of solidarity that had long been a staple of European 𝒰𝓃𝒾𝓃. By contrast, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic from 2020 was spread much more widely across the UK and Eurozone and stimulated a move towards jointly held debt to finance a massive package of regeneration entitled Next Generation EU. This programme, with its budget of €750 billion, almost twice the size of Germany's annual budget, further entangled national budgetary policy by requiring the approval of national plans by the Commission to ensure the plans promote both recovery and cohesion, which will in turn reinforce the Eurozone. The Eurozone crisis did not kill off the euro, as some had predicted, but it certainly highlighted the incomplete nature of the EMU and the problems such incompleteness creates. Next Generation EU, it marks an important step in the rebalancing of economic integration and might prove to be crucial in determining the long-term future of the EU as a whole. Page 191, the conclusion. This chapter has presented a wide range tour of the EU, looking at its policy competencies in various institutions and economic relations that continue as a key illustration of European integration. One of the key issues addressed was the debate between intergovernmental and supranational approaches to understand the EU. Today, the EU continues to embrace intergovernmentalism, but it has adopted a number of supranational characteristics as it has become wider and deeper. Of course, the EU has had a definable centre. It primarily exists in the form of its institutions, especially the European Council, the Council of Ministers, the Commission, the Parliament, and the ECJ. The real essence of EU politics is the constant interactions within and between EU institutions, in Brussels between national governments and Brussels, within the various departments in national government, in bilateral meetings between governments and between private interests and government officials in Brussels, and at the national level. Hicks and Holland, 2014, page 14. EU institutions therefore remain both intergovernmental and supranational in character. The debate, however, raises fundamental issues about the location of authority in the multinational, multi-level governance of the EU. And as such, this chapter will finish with some thought-provoking questions about the future direction of the EU. First, as the scope of the EU's powers and competencies expand and intensify, will the EU need to develop its own source of authority independent of that supplied by the member states? How might it do so? Such moves would further erode the authority of individual member states, which, it could be argued, is already happening as a result of independence and globalisation. Even the most enthusiastic member states have shown their limits on how far they might let the EU act. Conversely, despite increasing polling of sovereignty, citizens clearly still identify primarily with states. And those states still have control over the key political, legal, financial and military resources that shape the world. This legal, financial, military resources shape the world. This signifies the continued prominence of member states and could act as a check on further supranationalism. This, in turn, raises a second question. Is European integration a cause or a consequence of greater independence between states? Not only do most European states outside the EU want to join as members, but members themselves do not want it to be left behind each successive step of integration. Moreover, even on the outside of the European Union, there are clear effects on other states, as the UK is discovering as it works through the choice to leave the EU. The regulatory weight of the EU legislation is very significant indeed. Choosing to diverge on rules and processes, it might be politically tempting, but will come at an economic cost to those trading into the EU single market. The convergence that integration has produced among member states, looking for ways to better manage public policy challenges, has also effectively created a system that further compromises the ability of non-members to govern effectively by themselves. Of course, the UK's withdrawal from the EU also shows us that this is an irreversible process, especially in political terms, but it does not present a longer-term dilemma for all states in terms of how they manage a change in the world, where collective action makes ever more sense. Finally, if the EU develops an independent source of authority, will it also embrace its own state-like monopoly over the organised means of violence? In short, will the EU become more state-like itself? Certainly, the EU has global clout in terms of its economic power, and it has begun to instigate more cooperation on defence and security issues. So in some areas, it could be argued that it is already acting as one. And therefore, in a more state-like manner, globalisation and independence continue to force states to act together in regional blocs, such as the EU. And some feel that acting as part of a wider group is the best way of remaining competitive in the global economy as new powers emerge. The key question is whether this force is powerful enough to negate the strong ties that people have to state, and ultimately whether national interests can be maintained when sovereignty continues to be polled in ever-increasing institutional arrangements. Chapter 19, Culture, Right and Justice in Global Politics. 𝒰𝓃𝒹𝑒𝓇𝓈𝓉𝒾𝓃. Page 199. There are many examples of claims for rights in the international sphere. One example was reported on September 2002. The UK government was asked to make efforts to have a British man held by the US at Guantanamo Bay extradited to the UK as face-to-face charges of terrorism in connection with the attacks in the US on 11th of September 2001. Governs were expressed about the denial of this man's human rights at Guantanamo Bay. There are alleged terrorists entitled to human rights. Can the denial of their human rights be justified on any grounds? You might also think of any member of conflicts in recent times where rights have been held up against as a cause for states to intervene in the affairs of others. For example, humanitarian grounds were cited in NATO states' interventions in Kosovo during the 1990s and in the United Nations Security Council's approval of military force in Libya 2011. A significant change occurred in the vocabulary of international politics with the adaptation of 1945 Charter of the United Nations UN Charter, 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and later conventions clarifying and extending the notion of human rights. The UN Charter and the UDHR were an important part of the international post-war settlement and is established the UN as an organisation devoted to peace and security alongside human rights and the rule of law. So many states have joined the UN and signed the UDHR and later conventions that this had the effect of consolidating the concept of rights, both the rights of people to national self-determination and individual human rights. The 𝒰𝓃𝒃𝓈 in particular establishes a powerful moral claim for individual rights. It asserts that each individual matters, deserves to be heard, and must not be silenced. Each individual deserves respect, is entitled to be treated with dignity, regardless of their race, gender, creed, colour, or mental capacity. To specify its principles and norms, and signatory countries have come under pressure to implement those rights. Whether they actually do this in practice is a different story. And rights abuses by signatories continue to make the headlines. At the same time, the UN Charter expresses the intention to recognise that right of international self-determination and a corresponding principle of the sovereign equality among the different people of the world. Indeed, the ideas of rights and culture are closely linked in that the advocacy of individual human rights is tied to the notion of the right to self-determination. For peoples to statehold for national cultures, the policy identity of national community is an important part of its culture, but different groups in society perceive political identity differently, depending on their wealth, social position, cultural background, gender, geographical position, and age. Furthermore, different national cultures have different political identities. The language of rights and justice is one of the most common ways in articulating political disputes and of negotiating rival claims. In short, claims and counterclaims to rights and justice take place within national and how now international cultures, communities. It is agreed by most people that rights are a good thing, and in many respects they are. However, this chapter takes a critical view, exploring a different perspective on the global rights debate and the complexities of its competing positions. The belief in rights based on a moral assertion of the common humanity that will share is not itself justifying, and it needs to be located within the complex political field of global politics relations. This chapter will therefore look at debates around the notion of human rights in the global arena, exploring two perspectives that only differ accounts and how rights should be asserted. When we then come back to the idea of globalization and how this can be linked to global rights discourse. On whose terms are these claims articulated? Finally, we examine the issue of humanitarian intervention, exploring how states and organisations utilise the rights discourse in global politics. That is very, very important there. Rights to claim, rights to people, rights in any situation for life, rights at work, rights in a breakdown of relationship, rights to adult responsibilities, parental responsibilities. There are your rights. International Bill of Rights is never being met, is it? Not fairly, anyway. We can leave that there, page